The fog rolled in thick that morning, clinging to the fjord like a living thing. Ulva stood at the shoreline, her bare feet sinking into the cold sand as she gathered driftwood for the morning fire. The Norwegian coast stretched endlessly before her, grey water meeting grey sky in a seamless horizon. Her village of Lysfjord had always been small, peaceful, tucked between the mountains and the sea, where fishing boats outnumbered warriors, and the greatest concern was whether the cod would run thick that season. She should have noticed the silence. The gulls had stopped crying. The wind held its breath. By the time the longships emerged from the mist like sea dragons rising from the depths, it was already too late. Their red and black sails cut through the fog, and the sound that followed turned her blood to ice, war cries that seemed to shake the very mountains. Elva dropped her bundle of wood and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged gasps that tore at her throat. "Mama! Papa!" Her scream was lost in the chaos erupting around her. The Vikings were already ashore, pouring into the village like a flood of iron and fury. She saw old Bjorn cut down as he raised his fishing spear in defiance. She saw the church, the small wooden stave church her grandfather had helped build, catch fire, flames licking hungrily at its dragon-carved beams. Smoke burned her eyes and filled her lungs. She stumbled through her own village as though it were a nightmare landscape, familiar paths now littered with bodies and debris. A hand caught her arm, and for one desperate moment she thought it was her father. But the grip was wrong, too strong, too cruel. The Viking who held her was young, with wild eyes and fresh blood splattered across his leather armor. "Let me go." Alva twisted, clawed at his face, fought with everything in her. But she was 19 years old, barely 5.5 feet tall, and he was a seasoned raider. He laughed at her struggle, said something in Old Norse that she didn't understand, and struck her hard enough that stars exploded behind her eyes. When her vision cleared, she was being dragged toward the beach. Around her, other villagers, mostly women and children, were being rounded up like cattle. She saw her neighbor Ira, blood running from a cut above her eye, clutching her young son. She saw the baker's daughter, pale as death, being shoved toward the waiting ships. But she didn't see her parents. She didn't see them among the living or the dead, and that uncertainty was its own special torture. The Vikings moved with brutal efficiency, separating their plunder. The able-bodied were shackled. The elderly and infirm were simply left behind in the burning ruins. Alva's wrists were bound with rough rope that bit into her skin, and she was herded onto one of the longships with perhaps 20 others. The deck reeked of salt and blood and tar. She was pushed down among the other captives, squeezed between a sobbing child and a woman who stared at nothing with empty eyes. As the ship pulled away from shore, Alva turned back to watch her village disappear into the smoke and fog. Everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever loved, was gone. The weight of it settled on her chest like a stone, crushing the breath from her lungs. But beneath the grief and terror, something else stirred. Something harder and sharper, rage. These men had taken everything from her. They would not take her spirit. The voyage was a blur of cold spray, hunger and fear. They sailed north and east for days, the Norwegian coast a constant presence to starboard. The Vikings largely ignored their captives, except to throw them scraps of dried fish and stale water. At night, Alva huddled with the others for warmth, listening to their quiet weeping and prayers. She did not pray. She watched the raiders instead, learning their patterns, their hierarchy. The young one who had captured her was called Ivar, and he was low in the pecking order, eager to prove himself. The ship's leader was a grizzled warrior named Thorvald, who commanded with barked orders and casual violence. But there were whispers about someone else, someone who wasn't on this ship. The king, Rurik. The name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear, and Alva gathered that he led the entire raiding fleet from his own vessel. She caught glimpses of it sometimes, a larger longship with a fearsome dragon figurehead that seemed to watch her with painted eyes. On the 4th day, they reached their destination. A settlement sprawled along a protected harbor, far larger than Lysfjord had ever been. Wooden halls with peaked roofs, smoke rising from countless hearths, and everywhere the bustle of a prosperous trading centre. This was Nordhavn, she would later learn, the seat of King Rurik's power. The captives were dragged off the ships and lined up on the dock like goods at a market. And in a way, that's exactly what they were. Alva's legs shook beneath her, from the days at sea, from hunger, from the terrible knowledge of what came next. Slave traders moved through the line, examining teeth, feeling muscles, making crude comments that needed no translation. That's when she first saw him. The crowd parted, and a man approached with a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He was tall, taller than any man Alva had ever seen, with broad shoulders and the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His hair was dark blonde, touched with gold where the weak northern sun caught it, and plaited back from a face that was all hard angles and old scars. But it was his eyes that caught her, pale blue, like ice on deep water, and currently fixed on the line of captives with an expression she couldn't read. King Rurik. It had to be. The warriors around him deferred without him saying a word, and the slave traders stepped back to give him room. He walked slowly down the line, barely glancing at most of the captives. But when he reached Alva, he stopped. Those pale eyes met hers, and she refused to look away. She didn't know what possessed her in that moment, grief, rage, or simple defiance, but she lifted her chin and met his gaze with all the fire she had left. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. Then he spoke, his voice deep and rough like distant thunder. "This one. She comes with me." Alva's new chains were iron instead of rope, but they were chains nonetheless. She was separated from the other captives and led through the settlement's muddy streets by two of Rurik's personal guard. They didn't speak to her, didn't even look at her, which somehow made it worse. At least the raiders on the ship had acknowledged her existence, even if only as cargo. These warriors treated her like a piece of furniture being moved from one room to another. The king's hall dominated the center of Nordhavn. It was a massive structure of timber and stone, its peaked roof towering above the surrounding buildings. Dragon carvings decorated the doorposts, and the heavy wooden doors themselves were banded with iron, worked in intricate patterns. Inside, the space was warmer than Alva had been in days, heated by a long fire pit that ran down the center of the hall. Smoke rose to the high ceiling and escaped through vents in the roof, filling the air with the smell of burning pine. The hall was filled with activity, warriors sharpening weapons, women weaving at looms, children running between the benches, dogs fighting over scraps. It was a whole world contained within wooden walls, and Alva felt profoundly out of place in her torn dress and iron shackles. She was brought to a side chamber off the main hall, not a cell, but clearly not the master's quarters either. It was small but clean, with a sleeping bench covered in furs, a wooden chest, and a small brazier for heat. A basin of water sat on a simple table, steam rising from its surface. One of the guards unlocked her shackles, the sudden absence of weight almost disorienting. Then they left without a word, and she heard the bar drop across the outside of the door. Alva stood in the center of the room, rubbing her raw wrists, trying to process everything. She was alive. She was relatively unharmed. But she was also a prisoner in a strange place, claimed by a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. The stories about Rurik the Ruthless were legend, even in her small village. A warrior king who had united dozens of Norse clans under his rule, who could navigate by the stars and fight like a berserker, who showed no mercy to his enemies, and yet he had looked at her differently than the others, not with lust or cruelty, but with something closer to curiosity. As if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. She used the water to wash the grime from her face and hands, and discovered that someone had left clean clothes folded on the chest. A simple woolen dress in deep blue, far finer than anything she'd owned in Lisfjord. It felt wrong to wear it, like accepting her captivity. But her own dress was torn and filthy and stank of smoke and seawater, so she changed with shaking hands. Hours passed. The light filtering through the small window shifted from afternoon to evening. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but no one came. She heard the sounds of the hall through the door, laughter, music, the clatter of dishes. A feast, she realized. They were celebrating their successful raid, celebrating the destruction of her home. The rage returned, hot and bitter in her throat. Finally, as full darkness fell, the door opened. But it wasn't a servant with food, it was Rurik himself. He had to duck slightly to enter the small room, and suddenly the space felt even smaller with him in it. He'd changed from his travel clothes into a fine tunic of dark wool, embroidered with silver thread, though he still wore his weapons, a sword at his hip and a knife at his belt. His hair was loose now, falling past his shoulders, and in the flickering light of the brazier, his face was all shadows and sharp edges. Alva backed instinctively toward the wall, though she hated herself for it. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't. You haven't eaten. His voice was quieter than she expected, his Norwegian accent thick but understandable. He carried a wooden trencher with bread, cheese, and dried meat. He set it on the table, then stepped back, giving her space. You should eat. You'll need your strength. For what? The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with all the fear and fury she'd been holding back. For whatever you plan to do with me? Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. Do you think I brought you here to harm you? I think you destroyed my home, killed my people, and dragged me here in chains. What else am I supposed to think? He was quiet for a moment, studying her with that unnerving intensity. What is your name? She almost didn't answer. But what was the point in refusing? Alva, Alva. He repeated it, the name strange in his mouth. I am Rurik, though you likely know that already. He moved to lean against the wall opposite her, crossing his arms. I'm told you fought Ivar when he took you. Clawed his face rather badly. He's not pleased. I hope it scars. She lifted her chin defiantly. To her shock, Rurik laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his harsh features into something almost human. It might. He was quite indignant about it, his expression sobered. You have courage. That's rare. Most captives either weep endlessly or go silent. You met my eyes on the dock as if you wanted to challenge me to single combat. If I had a weapon, I would have. I believe you. He said it without mockery. That's why I claimed you. Alva's breath caught. I don't understand. Rurik pushed off from the wall and moved closer, though he was careful not to crowd her. My men take many captives. Most are sold to traders or kept as thralls. It's the way of things. But you... He paused, seeming to search for words. You have fire in you, spirit. I've learned to recognize it. Those with such fire either break completely or become something stronger. I wanted to see which you would be, so this is a test. Bitterness flooded her voice. You destroyed my life to see if I would entertain you by fighting back. No, his voice hardened. I destroyed your village, because that's what kings do. We take what we need to feed our people and expand our power. It's brutal and it's unfair, but it's survival. Your village was unfortunate enough to be in our path. He held her gaze. But what I do with you now, that's different. You could have gone to the slave markets. Instead, you're here in my hall, unchained and unharmed. Do you understand what that means? That I'm your property instead of someone else's. That you're under my protection, he corrected quietly. No one will touch you without my permission. No one will harm you. You'll eat well, sleep warm, and be treated with respect. In return, I ask only that you don't try to escape or cause trouble. Can you do that? Alva stared at him, trying to understand the game he was playing. His words sounded almost reasonable, but they came from the mouth of a man who had just admitted to destroying her entire world without remorse. Could she trust anything he said? But what choice did she have? And if I refuse? She asked quietly. Then you'll be given to the slave traders tomorrow. He said it matter-of-factly, without threat, simply stating reality. The choice is yours, Alva, but choose quickly. I won't ask twice. She thought of the empty-eyed woman on the ship, the weeping children, the uncertain fate that awaited them all in distant lands. At least here she would still be in Norway. At least here she might find a way to survive long enough to... What? Escape? Get revenge? She didn't know. But she couldn't do anything if she was sold across the sea. I won't try to escape. The words tasted like ash. And I won't cause trouble. Good. Rurik nodded, then moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at her. Eat, rest. Tomorrow you'll begin learning our ways. It will be difficult, but I think you're strong enough to bear it. He left, and the door closed behind him with a soft thud. But this time Alva noticed he didn't drop the bar. The door was closed, but not locked. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless. But it felt like something that might be the beginning of trust, or the beginning of her learning to play his game. Winter deepened over Nordhavn, and with it came a cold that Alva had never experienced in her coastal village. Here farther north and inland from the moderating ocean, the temperature plummeted until the very air seemed to freeze in her lungs. Snow fell in heavy sheets, burying the settlement under white silence. But the king's hall remained warm, its fires constantly fed, its thick walls proof against the wind that howled like wolves at night. Alva's days fell into an unexpected rhythm. She woke at dawn when the servants began stirring, though she was not counted among them. Rurik had made that clear to his household. She was not a thrall, not a servant, but something in between that no one quite understood, including herself. She took her meals in the hall with the other women of the household, learned to card wool and spin thread, listened to their gossip and stories. Most treated her with distant politeness, uncertain how to categorize this girl who had arrived in chains but now wore fine dresses and ate at the high table when the king requested her presence, which he did with increasing frequency. At first it was simply during the evening meal, where he would call her to sit near him and ask questions about her life before. Where had she learned to read? Her mother had taught her using the priest's books. What did she know of the stars? Her father had been a fisherman. She could navigate by the North Star and knew the names of a dozen constellations. What did she think of Nordhavn? It was larger and louder and colder than anywhere she'd ever been, but the mountains reminded her of home. And sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could almost pretend the sound of the wind was the sound of the sea. She tried to hate these conversations, tried to remember that this man was responsible for everything she'd lost. But Rurik was not what she'd expected. He was intelligent and well-traveled, having sailed as far as Byzantium and the lands of the Rus. He asked genuine questions and listened to her answers with attention that made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. He could be harsh with his warriors, demanding and unyielding, but with her he showed a patience that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. It confused her. Worse, it made him human. One night, about 6 weeks after her arrival, she was summoned to his private chamber. Fear spiked through her. This was what she'd been dreading, the moment he would finally demand payment for his protection. She went because she had no choice, her heart hammering, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Rurik's chamber was surprisingly austere for a king. A large bed with carved posts dominated one wall, covered in furs and woven blankets. A table held maps weighted with stones, and weapons hung from pegs, swords, axes, shields, each one obviously well used. A brazier burned in the corner, filling the room with warmth and the scent of pine. He stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered settlement, and didn't turn when she entered. "Close the door," she did, her throat tight. "You asked for me?" "I did." He finally turned, and she was struck by how tired he looked. There were shadows under his eyes she hadn't noticed before, lines of tension around his mouth. "Sit, please." She perched on the edge of a chair near the brazier, every muscle tense and ready to fight or flee. Rurik poured 2 cups of mead from a clay jug and offered her one. When she hesitated, he sighed. "It's not poisoned, Alva, and I didn't bring you here for what you're thinking." "Then why am I here?" He took a long drink from his own cup before answering. "Because I wanted to speak with you privately, away from the hall and the eyes that watch everything I do." He settled into the other chair, suddenly seeming less like a fearsome king and more like a man carrying a heavy burden. "Tell me, what do you hear when the people talk? What do they say about me?" The question surprised her. "They say you're a great warrior, a strong king, They're loyal to you. That's what they say to your face. What do they say when they think you're not listening? She studied him carefully, trying to understand what he wanted. They say you're ambitious, that you're planning something big, another raid, or maybe a war with the Danes. They wonder why you claimed me and what it means. She paused. Some think I'm your concubine, even though you've never touched me. And the others? Think I'm a spy or a political hostage, though they can't figure out from where, since Lysfjord was nothing. She met his eyes. Why did you claim me, Rurik? The truth this time. He was quiet for a long moment, firelight dancing across his features. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. Because when I looked at you on that dock, I saw something I recognized. Do you know what it's like to have everyone around you see only what they expect to see? The warrior, the king, the conqueror. They see the role, not the man. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But you looked at me with such honest fury, such defiance despite your chains, and you saw me. Not my reputation, not my title. Just a man you would fight if you could. I still would, she said quietly. I know. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That's what makes you dangerous and valuable. I'm surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, who fear me or want something from me. But you have no reason to lie. You owe me nothing but hatred. Then why keep me close? Why not send me away where I can't hurt you? Because I need someone who will tell me the truth. He said it simply, as if it were obvious. I'm planning something, Alva. Something that will either expand my kingdom significantly or destroy everything I've built. And I need counsel from someone who isn't blinded by loyalty or ambition. She laughed, the sound bitter. You want me to advise you? I'm 19 years old. I'm a fisherman's daughter. What could I possibly know about ruling kingdoms? You know about people. About loyalty and courage, and what matters when everything else is stripped away. He held her gaze. I've watched you these past weeks. You've adapted to a world completely foreign to you, without losing yourself. You've befriended people who should be your enemies. You've learned our language, our customs, but you haven't bowed your head or broken your spirit. That takes a kind of strength that most warriors never find. Alva felt something dangerous stirring in her chest, something that felt uncomfortably like pride. Like being seen. She pushed it down ruthlessly. You're trying to manipulate me. Yes, he admitted without shame. But that doesn't make what I'm saying untrue. I do need your counsel. And in return, I can offer you something you want, my freedom. The word came out sharp with longing, eventually perhaps. But first, knowledge. He stood and moved to the table with the maps, beckoning her to follow. She did, drawn despite herself. He pointed to a coastal area she didn't recognize. Lysfjord. Your village. I've sent men to see what remains. There were survivors who fled into the mountains. Some have returned and are rebuilding. It won't be what it was, but it lives. Tears burned her eyes before she could stop them. My parents? I don't know. My men couldn't get detailed information. But there are survivors. His voice gentled. I can't undo what was done. But I can tell you this, no more raids on that coast. Lysfjord and the surrounding villages are under my protection now. They'll pay reasonable tribute, but they'll be left in peace. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that? Because you asked, even though you didn't say the words out loud. Because I can. He turned to face her fully. I'm not a good man, Alva. I've done terrible things, and I'll likely do more before I'm done. But I'm not needlessly cruel, and I honor my debts. You've given me your word not to escape or cause trouble, and you've kept it, even though every day must be agony. That deserves recognition. She didn't know what to say. The hate she'd been nursing, the rage that had kept her strong, suddenly felt more complicated. This man had destroyed her home, yet he'd just given her the one thing she'd wanted most, news that it might somehow survive. He was her captor, yet he spoke to her with more respect than most free men had shown her in her old life. I don't understand you, she said finally. I don't understand any of this. Good. Rurik smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes, warming them. That makes two of us. But perhaps we can figure it out together. It was in that moment, standing in the warm chamber with maps spread before them and honest words hanging in the air between them, that Alva realized something terrifying. She was starting to see Rurik as something other than her enemy. Not a friend, not yet, but not simply the monster who destroyed her world. He was becoming real to her, complex and flawed and human, and that was far more dangerous than any chain. Spring came late to Nordhavn, but when it finally arrived, it transformed everything overnight. The snow melted into rushing streams. Ice broke free from the harbor with sounds like thunder, and the first ships set out to test the newly open waters. The settlement itself seemed to wake from hibernation. People emerged pale and winter-thin into the weak sunlight. Children played in the mud, and everywhere there was the sense of possibility that comes with surviving another northern winter. Alva stood at the harbor's edge, watching the waves and thinking about the sea journey that had brought her here 5 months ago. It felt like a lifetime. The girl who'd been dragged aboard that raiding ship seemed like a stranger now, someone young and naive who'd believed the world was simple, divided neatly into good and evil. She knew better now. Nothing was simple, least of all her own heart. "You're thinking about running," Rurik's voice came from behind her, quiet enough not to startle. He'd developed a habit of finding her in moments like these, when she sought solitude to sort through the tangle of her thoughts. "No," she said, and realized it was true. "I'm thinking about how much I've changed." He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He'd shed his heavy winter furs for lighter wool, and his hair was tied back in a simple knot. "Change isn't always bad, even when it means becoming comfortable with your captor." "Is that what I still am?" he asked softly. "Your captor?" Alva turned to look at him, really look at him. Over the long winter months, they'd spent countless hours together. He'd taught her to play Hnefatafl, the Norse strategy game, and she'd beaten him more often than not. She'd told him stories from her childhood, and he'd shared tales of his travels. She'd watched him adjudicate disputes with wisdom and patience, and she'd seen the weight of leadership press down on him like a physical thing. They'd argued about everything from the best way to navigate by stars to whether the old gods still watched over men. And slowly, so gradually she hadn't noticed it happening, the fear had faded. In its place was something far more complicated. "I don't know what you are anymore," she admitted. "I know what you were. I know what you did. But I also know the man who stays up late planning ways to improve crop yields so fewer families go hungry. The man who makes terrible jokes and has a sweet tooth for honeyed almonds. The man who asked for my counsel about the Danish problem and actually listened when I suggested negotiation before warfare. And what did you become?" he asked, watching her with those pale eyes that seemed to see too much. "While I was becoming more than your captor." She looked away out at the water. "I became someone I don't entirely recognize, someone who's starting to forget what she's supposed to be angry about. Alva." He said her name like a question, and when she didn't respond, he gently touched her chin, turning her face back to his. "You don't have to forget. The anger is yours to keep if you want it. But you also don't have—" Rurik's face transformed with a smile that made him look years younger. "My partner in what?" "Everything," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Counsel and trade and whatever grand plans you're making. I won't just be the girl you claimed from a raid. I'll be the woman who stands beside you and tells you when you're being an idiot, who helps you build something better than endless cycles of violence. I'll be someone who matters, not just to you, but to your kingdom." He came around the table to stand before her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You already matter, Alva. You've mattered since the moment you met my eyes on that dock and refused to look away. But yes, partners in everything." He held out his hand, palm up. "I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, I will never again be the cause of your suffering. What I can't undo, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make right." She looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Taking it would mean accepting everything. The pain and the possibility, the past and the future, the man he'd been and the man he was trying to become. It would mean choosing forgiveness without forgetting, strength without bitterness. It would mean rewriting her own story in a way she'd never imagined. She placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and sure. For a heartbeat, they just stood there, hands clasped, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. Then Rurik pulled her closer, slowly enough that she could have stopped him, and rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he whispered, and she heard everything those two words carried. Gratitude and relief, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. "Don't thank me yet," she managed a shaky laugh. "You might regret making me your partner when I tell you exactly what I think about your plan to expand territory northward. It's foolish and expensive," and he kissed her. It was soft and tentative, a question more than a demand. And when she kissed him back, it felt like answering something she hadn't known she'd been asking. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes held a warmth that melted the last of her carefully maintained defenses. "Still think I'll regret it?" he asked, his voice rough. "Absolutely." She smiled despite the tears on her cheeks, happy tears this time, not the bitter ones she'd shed for so many months. "But you're stuck with me now." "Good." He pulled her into his arms, and she let herself sink into the embrace, feeling safe and chosen, and finally, impossibly, home. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Outside, the spring wind carried the smell of new growth and possibility. The harbour filled with ships preparing for distant journeys. And in the king's chamber, two people who should have remained enemies began writing a new story together, one of healing and hope, of choosing love over hate, and of finding that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to exactly where we need to be. 3 weeks later, Elva stood at the prow of Rurik's ship as they sailed south toward new horizons. She wore a cloak of deep blue wool, clasped with a silver brooch, a gift from Rurik engraved with both their initials intertwined. Her hair whipped in the wind, and beside her, Rurik pointed out landmarks along the coast, his hand warm in hers. She thought about the girl she'd been, standing on a different shore, gathering driftwood on a foggy morning that seemed like it belonged to another lifetime. That girl would never have imagined this future. But perhaps that was the nature of survival. You couldn't predict what shape it would take or what it would cost. You could only keep breathing, keep choosing, keep believing that dawn would come even after the darkest night. "What are you thinking?" Rurik asked, his voice carrying easily over the wind. Alva turned to look at him, this man who had been her destroyer and became her savior, her captor and her partner, her greatest trial and her unexpected gift. "I'm thinking about how strange it is that the worst moment of my life led to this. To you, to becoming someone I never knew I could be." He squeezed her hand. "Do you regret it? Any of it?" She considered the question honestly. Did she regret the pain, the loss, the terror? Of course, those scars would never fully heal. But did she regret where that path had led her? The strength she'd found, the purpose she'd claimed, the love she'd discovered in the most unlikely of places? "No," she said finally, and meant it with her whole heart. "I don't regret it, because it made me who I am. And I think I'm starting to like who that is." Rurik smiled and lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'll build something worthy of who you've become. Something that honors what was lost by creating something better. A kingdom where raids aren't necessary because trade thrives. Where villages like Lisfjord can prosper in peace. That's a beautiful dream," she said softly. "Then let's make it real." He pulled her close, and together they looked toward the southern horizon where new lands and new possibilities waited. Together, and as the ship cut through the grey-blue waters of the Norwegian Sea, carrying them toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Elva finally understood what she'd really lost and gained in that raid so many months ago. She'd lost her innocence, her simple life, her illusion of safety, but she'd gained something far more valuable. She'd gained herself, the real Alva, the one who'd always been there beneath the surface, waiting for something monumental enough to call her forth. Strong, brave, capable of loving even when it seemed impossible, capable of forgiving even when it seemed unforgivable. She'd been captured in a raid and doomed to chains. But those chains had broken, and in their place she'd found wings. And now, standing on the deck of a Viking ship, with the man she'd chosen beside her and the whole world spread out before them, Alva was finally, truly free.